The village of Skjorn, surrounded by icy mountains and covered in dark forests, lived in an uneasy peace. Snow fell steadily, covering the wooden houses and barren fields. The simple, hard-working people believed that the dead rested in peace, but that was about to change in a terrifying way. Ulrich, a legendary warrior, had died in battle against invaders who threatened Skjorn. His courage was celebrated, and his body was buried with great honor, in a tomb adorned with swords, gold, and the helmet that had accompanied him in life. According to custom, the ceremony was supposed to ensure that Ulrich would be accepted into Valhalla. But something went wrong. That night, as the village slept, screams broke the silence. Vidar, a hunter who lived near the tomb, was the first to notice something strange. He heard heavy footsteps on the ice, as if a giant were walking through the forest. Curious, he left the house with his torch in hand, but what he found was terrifying. Ulrich's grave was open, and the disturbed earth seemed to have been dug from the inside out. The next morning, Vidar told the village council of his discovery, but many laughed, attributing it to the imagination of a man who had drunk too much. Only Bjorn, the young blacksmith, and Freya, the priestess, heeded the hunter's words. They knew that the Draugr, the undead creatures of Viking mythology, were not just legends to scare children. Confirmation came the following night, when an entire family disappeared. By dawn, their house was in ruins, as if a storm had passed through it. Claw marks were etched into the walls, and the floor was covered in blood. Vidar, upon investigating, found footprints leading into the forest, huge and heavy, as if they belonged to something that should not exist. "It's Ulrich," Freya said, her face pale. "He's back, but not as a man." Bjorn, intrigued and frightened, decided to take action. He visited Freya at the temple, where he had learned about the rituals that kept the dead from returning. She explained that something had been overlooked during the funeral. Ulrich's heart had not been pierced before he was buried, a detail essential to preventing a powerful warrior from transforming into a Draugr. With this information, Bjorn set to work. He forged a sword of pure iron blessed by Freya with ancient runes that had the power to repel evil spirits. But even armed, he knew that facing the Draugr would be more than a test of strength. It was a battle against something that defied the laws of life and death. That night, Bjorn made his way to Ulrich's grave, accompanied by Freya. The cold was bitter, and the silence of the forest seemed unnatural. As they approached, they saw Ulrich's figure in the distance. He was colossal, with eyes glowing like burning coals, gray skin, and a stench of death that seemed to poison the air. Ulrich was no longer a man, it was a monster. It carried a sword that seemed larger than Bjorn, and its steps made the ground tremble. When it saw them, it let out a scream that echoed through the forest, freezing the blood of both. Bjorn raised his sword and advanced. The Draugr attacked with inhuman strength, and the fight began. Freya in the background recited chants to protect him, but Ulrich seemed invincible. With each blow, Bjorn felt the weight of defeat approaching, but he did not give up. When the fight seemed lost, Freya threw a glowing rune on the ground, creating a circle that forced the Draugr to retreat for a moment. Taking advantage of the opening, Bjorn struck Ulrich, but the blow was not enough to defeat him. The Draugr roared and disappeared into the darkness of the forest, promising to return to complete his revenge. The village was safe for now, but Bjorn and Freya knew that this was only the beginning. The Draugr was an unstoppable force, and to defeat it they would need to face not only the monster but also the dark secrets that bound it to the earth. Dawn brought little peace to the village of Skjorn. After their terrifying encounter with the Draugr, Bjorn and Freya knew that time was against them. Ulrich, the warrior who had returned from the dead, would not give up so easily. And with each passing night, the risk of further disappearances and destruction increased. Freya, guided by the ancient teachings she had learned in her youth, suggested that they return to Ulrich's tomb. "There is something there," she said, her eyes weary. "A sign, a mistake that might explain why he returned as a Draugr." Hesitantly, Bjorn agreed, and as dusk fell, the two prepared for their journey. They took with them a torch, their enchanted sword, and a protective amulet made by Freya. When they reached the tomb, they found the place even more sinister than before. The earth was completely disturbed, and deep claw marks covered the tombstone. Freya knelt down and began examining the symbols engraved around the tomb. These are not the Draugr paused for a moment, hesitating as if recognizing the power of the runes. Bjorn seized his chance and attacked, but the monster dodged with a swift movement, striking him hard. Bjorn was thrown against a tree, but managed to get up, holding his sword steady. "He is bound to gold," Freya cried, trying to finish the incantation. "Ulrich will not rest while his treasure is cursed." With effort, Bjorn attacked again, this time striking the Draugr in the shoulder. The creature roared in pain, but the blow was not enough to bring it down. The Draugr retreated out of the circle of runes, glaring menacingly before disappearing into the shadows of the forest. With the monster at bay for now, Freya finally finished her incantation. "The circle of protection will not last long," she said breathlessly. "We must find Ulrich's treasure and break the curse that keeps him bound to this world." Bjorn helped Freya to her feet, and they both looked down at the open tomb. Inside, instead of peace, was chaos, the remains of what appeared to be a macabre ritual. Dried bloodstains, scattered bones, and golden objects with dark runes etched into their surfaces. "Someone knew what they were doing," Freya said, her expression grim. "And they did it to doom Ulrich and us." As they walked back to the village, Bjorn could not forget the look in the Draugr's eyes. It was not just hatred. There was something more, something that seemed to indicate that he too was a victim of greater forces. They knew that the fight was only just beginning, and that to win, they would have to face not only the Draugr, but the mystery behind the curse that had brought him back. After a terrifying night in Ulrich's tomb, Bjorn and Freya returned to the village, exhausted but determined. The truth they discovered was disturbing. Ulrich had been cursed, and the key to freeing his soul lay within his treasure. But breaking the curse would be a dangerous task, for the golden objects were tainted by a dark ritual. Freya spent the day at the temple, consulting ancient texts and sacred runes. Meanwhile, Bjorn gathered a small group of warriors from the village, telling them what he knew about the Draugr. Some called him mad, but others, remembering the screams in the night and the marks of destruction, agreed to help. "If we are to end this, we must act together," Bjorn said, sharpening his enchanted sword. "Ulrich will not rest while his treasure remains cursed, but someone has brought it back and we must find out who." Freya found the answer in an ancient text. According to the manuscript, Draugr were often bound to their earthly possessions, especially gold or weapons buried with them. The only way to break the curse would be to return the treasure to a sacred lake, where the gold would be purified by the waters, and its connection to the underworld would be broken. But there was a problem. The sacred lake lay beyond the cursed forest, a place avoided even by the bravest. It was said to be home to ancient spirits and dark creatures, and few who entered ever returned. That night, Bjorn, Freya, and the warriors prepared for their journey. They loaded the gold pieces from the tomb into a heavy chest covered in protective runes. The group entered the forest under the pale glow of the moon, knowing that each step brought them closer to danger. The first signs. As they walked, the silence of the forest was oppressive. No birds sang, and even the wind seemed to avoid this place. Freya led the way, holding an amulet that glowed faintly, indicating that the spiritual forces were at work. Suddenly, they heard a distant noise, like the sound of metal being dragged across the ground. The group stopped, and Bjorn raised his hand, signaling silence. From the darkness, glowing eyes emerged, accompanied by the guttural roar they had feared. Ulrich was there. The Draugr attacked with incredible force, swinging its massive sword at the warriors. One of them was struck and thrown away, crashing into a tree with a loud crack. The group panicked, but Bjorn shouted, "Protect the chest! Don't let him touch it!" Freya began chanting, trying to create a new circle of protection, but the Draugr was relentless. It advanced, knocking warriors aside like toys. Bjorn fought with all his might, but each blow seemed to only enrage the monster further. The dark revelation. In the midst of the chaos, Freya had a vision as she chanted the runes. In her mind, she saw a hooded figure performing the ritual that had cursed Ulrich. The figure was in the village, and Freya finally understood. The Draugr was not just a product of bad luck. Someone from Skjorn had brought it back intentionally. "Bjorn!" Freya shouted. "He is being manipulated. Someone did this on purpose." Bjorn, while struggling, replied, "Who would do this? And why?" Before I could. Bjorn faced the monster while Freya continued the ritual. This time the Draugr seemed weakened, as if the purification of the gold was draining its strength. In a moment of desperate courage, Bjorn struck a direct blow to the Draugr's chest, piercing its heart with the enchanted sword. The monster let out a terrible scream that echoed through the forest before collapsing into ash. Silence returned, and Freya completed the ritual. The remaining party returned to the village with a sense of victory, but Freya knew that the true threat was still there. The figure who had cursed Ulrich remained in the shadows, his dark purpose yet to be revealed. The return to Skjorn's village was silent. Despite the victory over the Draugr, the air was heavy with mourning for the warriors who had not survived. Bjorn and Freya were exhausted, but they knew that the fight was not yet over. The figure who had cursed Ulrich remained hidden, and the reason behind his resurrection remained a mystery. The next morning, Freya gathered the village elders to share her suspicions. "Ulrich did not return by chance," she began, looking at each of them in turn. "The ritual that brought him back was performed by someone here. We must find out who is responsible before another curse falls upon us." The elders murmured among themselves, but no one came forward. Then Bjorn suggested, "If someone is behind this, there must be proof. Let us dig up the grave again. Perhaps we missed something." Reluctantly, the elders agreed. With daylight, Bjorn, Freya, and a small group returned to Ulrich's grave. There, Freya began to examine the remains of the ritual more closely. Among the ash and bones, she found a piece of parchment with partially erased runes. Freya closed her eyes and muttered an incantation to restore the words. Slowly, the runes glowed and revealed a name: Sigvard. Bjorn recognized it immediately. Sigvard was a farmer from the village, a reserved and unsociable man who had been known to hold a grudge against Ulrich since his youth. But Sigvard was also skilled with the runes, having studied with a master in his youth. "He always hated Ulrich," Bjorn said, frowning. "But why would he do something like this now? Ulrich has been dead for years." Freya, her expression grim, replied, "Perhaps the hatred was not enough. Perhaps he saw an opportunity to use the Draugr for something more: power, revenge, control." The confrontation. Bjorn and Freya made their way to Sigvard's farm. There they found the man sitting near his hut, sharpening a knife. He greeted them with a false smile. "Sigvard," Bjorn began bluntly, "we know that you performed the ritual at Ulrich's grave. Why did you do this?" Sigvard laughed, but his eyes glinted with malice. "You are cleverer than I expected," he said, rising to his feet. "Yes, it was me. Ulrich took everything from me in life, my reputation, my farm, even the woman I loved. Then I decided he would serve me in death." Freya stepped forward, outraged. "You cursed the entire village. Didn't you realize the Draugr would be uncontrollable?" "I controlled Ulrich," Sigvard replied with a cold smile. "Until you interfered. He obeyed me. But when you began to purify the gold, you broke my connection to him." Before Bjorn could react, Sigvard held up a bone amulet, muttering words in a dark tongue. From the ground, shadows began to rise, forming grotesque humanoid figures, specters summoned by Sigvard's magic. Bjorn drew his sword, and Freya began to chant a protective spell. The specters advanced, but Bjorn faced them bravely, while Freya created a barrier of light to keep them away. Sigvard, seeing that he was losing control of the situation, tried to flee, but Freya cast a spell that immobilized him. The truth revealed. As Bjorn fought off the last specters, Freya approached Sigvard, who was kneeling on the ground, unable to move. "You sacrificed everything for revenge," she said, disgusted. "Now you will pay the price." Sigvard laughed, even in defeat. "Do you think this is over? I am not the only one who knows how to use the runes. There are others, more powerful than I. You will never escape the darkness you have awakened." With these words, he bit into something hidden in his mouth, a small crystal that shattered with a sharp sound. Sigvard screamed as his body was consumed by a blue flame, disappearing completely. Freya stared at the empty spot where he had stood, disturbed. He killed himself, but what did he say about other rune practitioners? Could it be true? Bjorn, bloodied but alive, approached. If it is true, we will face it. As always, a temporary peace. With Sigvard dead and the Draugr destroyed, peace had returned to the village of Skjorn, but there was an uneasy feeling in the air. Freya continued.